So welcome everyone who's joined us so far. We're really excited to have you all on board here today to talk about product management. We've got our very experienced and expert trainer, Paula Gray, with us all the way from the US. So we welcome you, Paula, and thank you so much for joining us today. And yes, I just want to remind everyone that for some reason it won't let me unmute you or unmute everyone, or won't let you unmute yourselves. So if you have a question at the end or throughout, please just either pop it in the chat or just raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom, and I'll unmute you right away. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Paula, who's going to take us through this journey today. So enjoy.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. So as Nicole said, my name is Paula Gray, and I'm one of the original co-founders of the AIPMM, which stands for the Association of International Product Marketing and Management. So yes, I've been in the world of product management and working with product managers for over 20 years. So by education, I am a social scientist. So my degrees spans psychology, sociology, and anthropology. So I have a very different perspective on how product management is done in organizations. And then also how product managers fit in the organization, what their role looks like, how they can be successful, because that's what I study, and I've been working with product managers for over 20 years. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to talk about product management in specific, but in general, like what this looks like and how to be successful as a product manager, because the corporate culture, your years of experience, the industry you're in, all affects how you do your job. So that's what I'm sort of going to unpack a bit today. So first, we're going to look at defining, what do I mean by boundary spanning? It sounds rather technical, and it is something that we study in business anthropology and sociology. So we're going to define what it means and the role of the product manager, how the product manager sits in that boundary spanning position. Then we're going to look at, okay, so now that we know that, what challenges now does that pose for a product manager? And then the final section will be, how do we overcome that, or how do we sort of mitigate that a bit? So there's some steps and some insight that will help you as a product manager be more successful in understanding these 4 key items. So we'll move into that. We'll look at relationship skills that are really important for a product manager to have. We're going to look at organizational credibility, organizational knowledge, and domain knowledge as well. And we're going to go through each one in detail. So first, let's define, what do we mean by boundary spanning? So here is a great bit of a graphic here that you'll see that. So there was some original research done in 1985 looking at this boundary theory of where the product manager sits. Now, what they found in this research was that the product manager is sort of a conduit, okay? It's sort of a conduit between the external environment and the internal environment, the firm, okay? So this is a great picture that shows that information from the external environment sort of flows through the product manager to the internal organization. That doesn't mean that every bit of information only throws through the product manager, but what this means is that the product manager is really this conduit. It's a channel through which all this information passes. Now, we also look at the product manager also works within, between, and among all the other internal departments as well. So this is a really great graphic to see. Notice the product manager doesn't sit in any of the internal bubbles. The product manager sits, on the outside, and sort of also channels that internal information as appropriate to the external pieces as well. So those lines are all the flow of information. So the product manager, look at this. works with the external competition, the consumers or customers, other organizations, consultants or retailers, and then works within, among, and between those internal groups as well. So the boundaries that we're talking about here exist within the organization. There's clear boundaries between those departments in the organization. And then, of course, between the organization and the external environment. And then, and of course, between those external organizations as well. And the product manager sort of bridges that or spans all of those boundaries. So as a flow of information and also interaction as well. So that role, as I said, requires the product manager to bridge or span all of those boundaries that exist. And one of the things I like to think about too in an organization is the product manager is uniquely an outsider. Okay, as you saw, that bubble sits by itself. I like to think of the product manager sort of as the anthropologist in the organization. One of the things that we learn in anthropology is that we are forever the outsider. Even if we're studying a culture, like in cultural anthropology, even if we're studying our own culture, where we live, that we are a member of, we're still an outsider when we begin to study that culture. We will forever be an outsider. That's one of the things they tell us when we begin studying anthropology. Now, if you notice, if you remember in that graphic, then the product manager not sitting in any other department, sitting often alone, forces them to span and bridge those gaps. Also, I like to think of the product manager as translating. So, for example, internally, the product manager will often translate between departments. Okay, will be the one, so I mean little t translate, obviously not native tongue, but rather to translate, let's say, the language of development to customer service or customer support, or to translate the needs or the complexities of marketing to development, for example. So they are the ones that sort of oversee all of this process. Okay, that's why this role is, it's a pretty amazing role, and why I have such tremendous respect for the people who sit in this role, because you're looking not only across the entire organization, but externally as well. So one of the things that you have to do is to translate between the internal and external environment, and within, between, and among internal departments as well, because no one, think about it like this, no one has the unique view that a product manager does. No one oversees everything like this, like a product manager does. Development or R&D, they've got their heads down and they're focused on their piece of it. Marketing, focused on their piece of it. Customer support or customer service, focused on their piece. Accounting, human resources, whatever, they're all focused on their piece. But the product manager looks at all of that and doesn't have this view, but has this sort of more global view. Now, that bridging and spanning and translating causes some pretty unique stress for the product manager. Again, there's a particular sense of comfort of being an insider somewhere, but the product manager isn't an insider in any of these departments, so internal or external. So it causes a unique kind of stress. So after all these years of working with product managers who sit in this role, I have seen some steps and skills that will help in sort of mitigating that, and will help in being successful in that role. So we're going to look at that. So the first one is relationship skills. Okay, so relationship skills. So let's first talk about relationships inside the organization. So as I said, the product manager belongs to no department. That's why they're sort of sitting, they're that outsider. And the internal stakeholders that the product manager deals with works with span pretty much every internal department. Now, what's interesting too is often there's conflict between those departments. Okay, R&D and engineering, and maybe marketing and advertising, or customer support. Oftentimes there's conflict between those departments, and the product manager has to mitigate that a bit. And so that's an incredibly challenging position, because none of these departments are required to cooperate with the product manager. Their job is to do their thing, to put their heads down, get development done, get the advertising and marketing materials done. None of them are required to cooperate with the product manager. They're required to do their job. And yes, it's expected that they work with product management and the product manager, but they're not required to. So those relationship skills become very important for the product manager. So the product manager must strike this really delicate balance between those other internal departments, bridging those departments, as I said before, translating between them. The product manager, what's going to make them successful in doing this is, number one, to be able to empathize. Okay, to empathize with why is development struggling, what timelines is marketing working with, or sales working with. So to be able to, number one, empathize with each different department and with the complexities of their world. Okay, again, you're not an expert on it, but you span all of that, so you need to understand each of these internal stakeholders departments and what's complex about those departments. You've got to sort of feel their pain to understand what their challenges are. Then your job then, especially when you've got conflicting priorities, okay, and some conflict between the departments, is to assess the priorities. Okay, so as I said, no one has that sort of global view like the product manager. So they're the ones that can really assess the priorities. And then the final step here is then to persuade, okay, to have that level of persuasion in getting these teams to work together and getting the priorities pushed through in that sort of proper format. Now, that has to come from empathizing, right? Because in persuasion, you can't persuade a person unless you know what's moving and driving their needs and their feelings and their motivations. So the ability to persuade rests heavily on the ability to empathize. So if these individuals are not required to cooperate with you, there's no clear requirement of it, you've got to persuade them. You've got to help them see the benefit in following your priorities, your guidance there. So those three skills are incredibly important in building relationships inside the organization. That ability to empathize and feel another person's pain and understand their drivers. Number two, assess the priorities of what needs to happen next. And then that ability to persuade those individuals. Now let's flip to the external relationships, because again, you span all of that. So we're talking about, and think of how complex this is. The customers, other businesses, the individual consumers, your partners, your competitors, right? You may have some sort of relationship with competitors, consultants as well that might utilize your product or recommend your product. Distributors and channel partners are key important relationships. Analysts and media, oh my gosh, they're responsible for doing analysis and reviews. They may be, if this is appropriate for your product. So that's incredibly important on building those relationships. Industry and thought leaders or influencers in your industry. government agencies, legislators. Your product may be heavily regulated by the government. So all of these are important relationships. So the product manager should not feel that they are just being drug along by all of this and pulled through it, but rather being on top of this, maintaining, initially developing these relationships and then maintaining them, because you're also translating between all of these, thought leaders and influencers, translating what they're doing and their priorities to the internal stakeholders as well, or the government agencies, legislators, partners. So often that product manager is very influential in maintaining these relationships. So that same set of skills is important. The ability to empathize, set priorities, and then persuade is equally important in the external relationships as well. Now let's look at the second piece here, what I call credibility. Okay, so for others' peace of mind. So when you think about it, so a lot of trust has to be put into the product manager, of course, from internal and external stakeholders. So the product manager has to have a level of credibility. If they are going to persuade and they're going to empathize, they have to have a level of credibility so that they that those stakeholders can have a sense of trust in the product manager. One way is, of course, a professional certification that we offer at the AIPMM. Now, what adds to credibility there is that it's a third-party validation of an individual's knowledge, skills, and abilities. It's not me, trust me, trust me, I know what I'm doing. No, this is a third party saying this person has met a certain level of competence and expertise in that area. So instead of relying on me as the product manager and my word, hey, trust me, I know what I'm doing, a third party really, and that adding a certification really adds to the ability to gain that trust. Again, that's for others' peace of mind. So when choosing a certification, just in general, is that it's got to have global credibility. So something that will cause it to carry more weight when it has that global credibility. When you're looking at a certifying body, it must have a well-established breadth and depth of influence and knowledge. Unless you're getting a certification in some very specific task, you want to choose a certification that has that breadth and depth of knowledge. And a published body of knowledge is key as well. In research done in sociology, when I actually wrote a paper on this, on a job going from an occupation to a profession. It's sort of when it gets promoted to a real profession. That's when a published body of knowledge happens. And for example, here at the AIPMM, we published the body of knowledge called the ProdBoK, the Product Management and Marketing Body of Knowledge. So publishing a body of knowledge helps to add credibility to that certifying body. Now, again, the reason for this and how it adds credibility internally, it establishes trust for others, and it mitigates risk. Okay, so someone else, some third party has given their stamp of approval or seal of approval to you as a product manager, that you, when you advise on some best practices, that you know what you're talking about. It's for your individual peace of mind. So for the others' peace of mind, it instills trust, right? But for our peace of mind as a product manager, it's knowing that you possess, you have a competence level in best practices. So for many years, product managers came to that position. They came from development, or they came from marketing, they came from sales or other departments. And they moved into product management without having any structured learning about best practices. So there's there's a certain risk in just sort of doing what we know how to do rather than working from best practices. So that level of credibility by having a third party certify our knowledge means that we know more than just how we've done it before, but we have a bigger scope, a bigger view of how product management can be done. The other thing for our peace of mind is that when we know what we don't know, okay, so this is when we come into the awareness that there's gaps in our knowledge, okay. At the beginning, we may not necessarily know that because we're doing the processes that we've always done. When we begin to get a level of experience that opens up and makes us aware of the gaps, then that third-party certification can help us not only fill in those gaps, but secondly, help open us up to a set of experts who can help us. You know, when we know what we don't know, then look to experts who do know. So it gets us in touch there. So now let's look at the third piece here of what makes us successful as product managers sitting in that role, and that's organizational knowledge. Okay, so this is what I mean here. It's bigger than just the org chart. Okay, I don't mean just understanding the structure of the company, but I mean the organizational culture. Okay, so with cultures, you know, of course, we have our culture of origin. Okay, so I'm going to start from there and give you a little bit of cultural anthropology here. We have our culture of origin that we're born into. That's sort of that native culture, our culture of origin. Okay, then we may become members of subcultures as well as we grow up. There may be a particular religious subculture. We may be in a generational subculture, okay? But all cultures have some particular frameworks underpinning them. Now, once we get old enough to, get our first job, then we are understanding and learning the organizational culture. Okay, so that's different. Now, organizational culture is different across industries. So I can tell you that organizational cultures in pharmaceutical companies are very different from organizational cultures in software companies. Okay, so industry-wide, they're different. Now, when we go from industry, we go to a specific company. So a specific company in the pharmaceutical industry will have its own organizational culture, or a specific company within software will have its own organizational culture. So to be successful, operate just like in our native culture, our culture of origin, to be successful, we have to learn the rules of it, right? Same thing with organizational culture. To be successful as a product manager in an organization, you need to understand the culture of that organization. So the norms, okay? What is normative behavior? Okay, are we cool and hip and happening? Do we have nap pods and we hang out with our feet on the desk and a very relaxed culture, or is it a little bit more structured, a little bit more formal? Now, one's not right or wrong. It's just understanding how it's done here. Okay, so norms are what's normal, what is expected of me. Now, taboos are those things that are avoided. Okay, and now this could be something like it's taboo to be late for a meeting. Okay, so it's it's a negative thing, will have negative consequences, not just it's an inconvenience. No, in this organization, it is so taboo to be late for a meeting because it shows disrespect. And, so it could be, that could be a taboo, or bringing up a particular product that wasn't successful. Maybe that's taboo. We don't bring that up, or we don't, send an email to the head of another department. That's taboo to do that. Okay, so those are those things that are avoided or considered inappropriate in that organization. And that varies by organization, right? So it just depends. So, and I think of software companies in the Bay Area versus a pharmaceutical company, that those cultures are very different. So they would have a different set of norms and taboos. Now, another thing would be understanding those unwritten, unspoken rules. Okay, so here's one. This is kind of funny, and it's a ridiculous example, but it illustrates the point. Why do we not go into a meeting in the office room and bring potted plants, our favorite potted plant, with us into the meeting? You're thinking, that's kind of ridiculous, Paula. Right, but where is that rule? Where do I find on rules for meetings that I'm not allowed to bring my favorite fern to sit next to me on the table in a meeting room? Okay, there's no rule that says that. That is an unwritten, unspoken rule that you just don't do that. Okay, but I'm using that, ridiculous extreme here to illustrate the point. But there's a lot of rules that are unwritten and unspoken. Okay, that we just know to follow. That isn't written anywhere. So understanding that. So here's another internal or unwritten, unspoken rule. I worked with an organization that, of course, had all of the C-level leaders. But what was interesting is the human resource, the leaders in the human resource department were incredibly powerful in the organization. That sort of like ties into the social hierarchy. Who wields the power? Okay, so in this company that I worked with, it was the individuals in the human resource department that would dictate a lot of strategy for the organization, policy for the organization, because they were part of that legacy. They had been there for several decades, had been there through a merger acquisition, and they wielded a tremendous amount of power, even to the C-level executives. So they would clear strategy and policy decisions with these individuals in the human resource department. So that's why I said it's not just the org chart. Okay, it's bigger than the org chart. Understanding this complexity and this cultural infrastructure, it really is an infrastructure or a framework inside the organization. Okay, it's the path by which information moves. It's the structure of the power and how decisions are made. It's not necessarily according to the org chart. Okay, it's not linear, just up the line of power or influence. No, it can be that individuals in that example at lower levels on the food chain, if you will, can wield tremendous influence. So also looking at that legacy, the heritage or history of the organization. Now, I've seen companies that have gone through mergers and acquisitions that the smaller company that was acquired by the larger company never really quite fit in. And so they were sort of viewed a little bit as outsiders. There was a little bit of underlying hostility to the individuals from the company that were acquired. It was so understanding that. Okay, so that's an unwritten, unspoken rule too. These are all interconnected. Each one of these bullets sort of is interconnected. That if we need to get something done, we have to go outside our little team that were acquired. We have to pull someone in from the parent company now to help us as an ally to get something done. So, so that the history, the legacy, especially in mergers and acquisitions, there can be, that sort of stepchild kind of feeling from the team that was acquired. But also it's looking at what products did we have over the years in our history? How has that affected what we're doing now? Has there been a big change in partners or vendors, or has a competitor done something in the history that caused us to change how we do something in this company. So it's important to identify that as well. As I said, the internal framework or structure of how things are done. So whether, this is where, yes, of course, the org chart does affect how we do things, but then also that sort of knowledge infrastructure, knowledge framework as well. It's important absolutely to know that social hierarchy. As I said, just because they're higher up on the org chart does not necessarily mean they're more powerful, or just because someone's an individual contributor or someone is in a support department does not mean that they don't wield power. So who wields the power? This is important to get to know rather quickly when you're working in an organization. Who wields the power? Okay. And again, you're not just looking necessarily up the org chart, but who else there as well? Who controls information flow? That's huge, because the flow of information is power as well. So then that sort of leads to who would be a good ally. Okay, of course, your senior leadership directly above you, but there's other individuals in the organization that would be a good ally as well. And of course, you need to have allies in all the departments internally, right? Remember, you're working with every department there, internally and externally. So who's a good ally in all of those departments, and who's a good ally in those external organizations as well? Okay, and this doesn't have to be in an official sense, but who is going to give you some information and give you some insight, maybe, that it doesn't necessarily have to be in an official sense, but you want that information coming to you and to be able to respond. So sometimes an ally may be someone lesser in the social hierarchy, but has access to information. So the organizational knowledge is huge, and it does take, and this, as anthropologists, this is what we study here. When we go to study a group of people, we absolutely begin to look for patterns. So how do you know what's a norm? How do you know what's a taboo? How do you know what those unwritten rules are? You begin to look for patterns of behavior. And absolutely, you can be, even if you've been in an organization for a long time, you can begin to sort of take this lens of an anthropologist and begin to analyze this as you're looking internally as well. Okay, so you can begin to see patterns. So think through the next time. So now, as you're moving through your day and you're making decisions, ask yourself, why do I do it that way? Why does she do it that way? Or why does he do it that way? Is there some sort of rule here? And so begin to think through that, because it becomes natural to us once we have been what's called enculturated into an organization. Then it becomes just normal to us. But when we sort of step back and begin to analyze all of these processes, then we can leverage them. Okay, that's why it's not just, oh, this is interesting information. No, we're learning this and analyzing that so we can leverage these pathways of information, the pathways of power, getting some insight so we can leverage these rules. Okay, so remember persuasion when we talk about interpersonal skills. Well, we have to know what's normal or inappropriate in order to, even if it's unwritten and unspoken, so that we can work within that. This is the framework in which that we are operating. So incredibly, incredibly important. All right, now let's move on to domain knowledge. Okay, so this looks at a great tool that I like to use here is Porter's 5 forces. Okay, 5 competitive forces. So the domain knowledge really helps you understand the complexity of, and we're going to look at Porter's 5 forces in a second, of how it applies to you as an individual, okay, as an individual product manager, your product itself, your organization as a whole, the industry and its complexity, the geographic region, and the global and cultural context. That's That's pretty important. That's pretty complex. Okay, because you see that all of these are interdependent, and the geographic region affects your industry, which of course affects your organization, your product, and you, right? And what's going on in the global and cultural context affects all of that as well. So it's not just I'm a product manager, I manage this product, I sell it through these channels. No, you're operating within the, industry context. You're operating within a geographic context and a global context as well. So this is incredibly complex. So I love Porter's 5 forces to help break that down. So I'm just going to walk through Porter's 5 forces here, and a really deep understanding of this. It's a model that's been around for a while because it's successful. Okay, Dr. Michael Porter developed this based on his research. So he said that there are 5 forces. Now, there's a reason he used the word force here. Okay, so as a force, sort of pressing in on, or pressure, creating pressure on each of these pieces. So the 5 forces he identified was that center: rivalry, competitive rivalry. So you and your competitors sit there. Okay, so you need a deep understanding of how the pressure of that rivalry affects you, your product, your organization, the industry, the geographic contents, and the context, and the cultural context as well. How do each of those impact that competitive rivalry? Then the suppliers. Okay, Dr. Porter said, think about how much pressure the suppliers are applying to you. So the number of suppliers that you have, the uniqueness of your product and your competitor's product as well. The uniqueness of the supplier's product. The strength and control the suppliers have over you. So for example, if you've got a supplier that sells a widget and you can't get that widget from any other supplier, that it's, let's say, unique to your manufacturing product, then that supplier has a tremendous pressure, is applying tremendous pressure on you. That's difficult then. So knowing how much impact and pressure suppliers have over you is important. Then the buyers. Okay, so these are the customers, the buyers, whether they're business customers or individual consumers. The number of them affects your world and how you do your job. The difference between you and your competitors. So this is then when buyers compare, and can they get their products from one of your competitors? How easy is it for them to switch? Okay, the cost for them to switch. So understanding this context is important for you and your role as a product manager. Then let's look at barriers. Okay, so Dr. Porter said that this force called barriers, I've also seen it as threat of new entrants. But what he's talking about here is, are there barriers that prevent new competitors from joining you in the center with your current competitors? Okay, joining you in the center of rivalry there. What barriers prevent new competitors from entering the marketplace? What are their access to inputs? Okay, so when you think of barriers, it's a pretty high barrier to enter the automobile manufacturing rivalry, right? You can't just, an entrepreneur just can't wake up one day and say, hey, I think I'll manufacture a car. I think that'd be fun. No, there's some barriers that prevent them from becoming a competitor, because that's a pretty complex industry. Then Dr. Porter said, think about substitutes. What substitutes could customers use in lieu of you and your competitors? So this is not your competitor's product here. That's not what sits in substitutes. It's what different solution a customer could have that isn't one of your or your competitors' products. So for example, let's say accounting software. Let's say you and your competitors make accounting software. Well, a substitute could be an Excel spreadsheet, right? Okay, That's not a competitor, you know, not in the center with you and your other accounting software competitors. That's a substitute. They could just use an Excel spreadsheet or one of those old-fashioned paper ledgers. They could use that. That's a substitute. So when we look at how much pressure the substitutes put on us, we're looking at how does the substitute perform? Are they going to get the same functionality? Are our customers or potential customers going to get the same functionality out of that substitute as they do with us and our competitors in the center there? What is the cost of substitution? So Porter said, think about, do substitutes apply a tremendous amount of pressure or force on you? Okay, so this is important. So you as a product manager just should have these 5 pieces in your mind, and you should look at them and revisit them. Now, here's one thing. So Porter did describe these as forces. He wanted you to see how much pressure each one of these is putting on you. And if you've got one that's exerting a lot of pressure on you, that's a vulnerability. Okay, so if you have only a single supplier that you can go to for a particular piece of your product or piece of technology, then that supplier pressure is incredibly intense. Okay, that's a vulnerability for you. If you've got so much dependency on one supplier, that's a vulnerability for you, because they could raise the price, they could go out of business or get acquired. They could change their production process or manufacturing process and change the widget you need, and you're stuck then. So Porter said that any one of these forces that apply a tremendous amount of pressure is a vulnerability, and you as a product manager might think through, how can we mitigate that vulnerability? How can we reduce that vulnerability? Should we look at some other suppliers? Should we, how can we do that? How can we mitigate that? All right. For Porter's 5 forces, love this model. In our certified product manager classes, we actually go through this through everyone's products in the class, because this is just, I mean, there's some great models out there. I love the PEST and SWOT and all of those. But this is really good as a product manager, is that one that you need to keep top of mind and look for any changes as well. Remember, you're looking in the global context here. Okay, so unless you're just a small regional product, but even then you're likely getting supplies externally and from global sources as well. We've seen, oh my goodness, how COVID has affected all of this here. Every one of these 5 forces was affected by these huge economic shifts, and how cultures have been changed, how our, just in our looking at the culture and how we interact and how we do business and how we work as individuals has all changed. So it's important to revisit this. All right. Now, I just want to summarize. I know I've given you a lot to think about here, but I just wanted you to sort of get this overview that the product manager is a complex boundary spanning role. Okay, so as I said, you span within, between, and among the internal teams, and you span those external organizations as well. And you're sort of the conduit through which that information passes. So you need to understand all of it. You need to have that big sort of global view, because all of it affects your product and all of it affects how you do your job. And that's why I often call the product manager the anthropologist in the organization, because you're forever the outsider. Okay, you're forever the outsider, but there are some knowledge, skills, and ability that help you in this process. Number 1, relationship skills we talked about. Remember, the ability to empathize with individuals internally and externally. And then the ability to set priorities. So understand what their challenges are, why you're getting pushback. So understanding that, set the priorities, and then persuade, because you can't force all of these stakeholders. You can't force them to do what you want. So you've got to persuade them to do what you need them to do, because you see you're the only one that has that big, global vision. Each of those departments and the external stakeholders as well, they're all focused on their role. We talked about having credibility. That makes it easier to do your job. That's important, that you have a level of credibility, because remember, a lot of trust has to be placed in you. Okay, if I'm in development and I'm relying on you to sort of translate for the sales their challenges, or vice versa, I've got to have a level of trust in you, the product manager, that you are translating effectively, that you are unbiased, especially if a product manager used to sit in one of those teams. That's especially important, that you have that sort of credibility. And not just for those external or for the stakeholders, but also for you to feel confident. Okay, for you to feel confident that you know best practices and that you can guide and persuade effectively. Okay, so that's important. Then we looked at organizational knowledge. That is so important. Understanding that organizational culture, understanding how business is done, how work gets done inside the company. And there's no like good or bad structure. It's just how companies have evolved. Often young companies have very different structures than older companies. And as I said, across industries as well, they have very different structures. So knowing how to operate within that and leverage that structure to your benefit will make your job easier and will help you in that persuasion. And then, of course, domain knowledge. Okay, that's critically important, because you've got to understand all of that context. That's why, excuse me, I tapped the Porter's 5 forces. Just one model. There's lots of great models there, but that one is sort of a quick way to really understand the domain, okay, of your industry, right? So we see product managers oftentimes changing industries, okay? So they take those best practices that they know and they go to a different industry. Well, very quickly, you can gain that domain knowledge by doing that Porter's 5 forces, and understanding that's going to help you understand that industry, where your vulnerabilities lie, and again, where your product sits in all of that context. So this is a great slide here that's got a graphic. So this is the framework that we use at AIPMM, and inside is the phase review process. So we'll make sure that you have access to that. We'll give you that link and you'll be able to access all of that. It's pretty complex. We teach it in the CPM class. We also teach it in the CPMM, the product marketing manager class, but it really outlines the complexity of what you do every day. And this is just the basic product management, getting the product through the life cycle. But you see here, to be an effective product manager, you have to have a whole other set of skills as well. I want to thank you for being here today, and I want to open up for some questions. But if you have questions after this, if we don't get to your question, there is my email address. Please reach out to me via email if we don't get to your question. And Nicole, I'll open it up for you and any questions anyone might have.
Hello, thank you so much, Paula. That was excellent. I hope everyone enjoyed that. And yeah, if you have any questions, like I said, just raise your hand or just pop it in the chat. Either way, I can help with that.
So I've asked while you're looking through that. So I've been asked, okay, if I start a new job, what's the first thing that I do? Okay, what's the first thing? All right, well, the first thing, hopefully you have built relationship skills before that particular job change. You have this ability to empathize, set priorities, and persuade. So that spans any company that you work for, the first thing you're going to need to do now, it will depend on if you're in the same industry that you've been in, then you have that sort of domain knowledge, then you're good there. Then the first thing you're going to need to do, if you're staying in the same industry, then is to get that organizational knowledge. Okay, understand that hierarchy. As I said, it's bigger than the org chart, and begin to look for patterns. Begin to ask, if you offer to do something and they say, no, we don't do it like that here, there's your unwritten, unspoken rule. Okay. And you might say, oh, why is that? Or, why is it done that way? So just be curious. Don't be judgmental or critical. Be curious. And a lot of times people will open up and give you a little more insight and a little bit more knowledge there, so you understand why it's done that way, so that you can, again, the goal here is to leverage that and work more effectively within that internal infrastructure.
Excellent. No, that's great advice. And I think it's probably something that everyone can take away, not only product managers. It's something that, is transferable across all industries, but particularly so within this role, as you mentioned, because of the internal and external stakeholders that you have to deal with and how you have to push on all of the departments. So that's really great. Thank you so much. It looks like we've got one question.
Okay.
What main problems can product managers face when dealing with other departments within the organization?
Well, usually there can be some pushback. So when a product manager is trying to persuade, and I'll give you an example here. I worked with one organization, and they knew it was a best practice to do market research. That was important. But their marketing team said, we have a similar competitor. We don't need to do market research. Let's just do what the competitor does. But the product management team really wanted to do their own original market research and answer their own their own research question, which we don't get when we're just copying the competitor. So they got pushback on that. They said, market research isn't that important. Let's just do what the competitors do. So often they can get pushback when the product manager knows those best practices and they're trying to push those best practices and get adherence to those best practices. There can be some resistance in the other departments. So there can be resistance. Remember, the product manager doesn't wield that power and control over the other departments. So they often will get some resistance to speeding up a process, adding another step, so they can get some resistance. That's why those, number one, understanding the organizational knowledge. Where are your allies in the organization? Who can you pull in to sort of assist that process? Also, those relationship skills are important. So when you're trying to push a best practice that is best for this product and this organization, and you get some resistance there, use those persuasive abilities. So first, understand, why am I getting pushback? What is driving the resistance on the other side? Is there a fear of moving forward? Is it a fear of loss? Is it a fear? What is driving the resistance? So first, empathize. Okay. And empathizing involves listening. Okay. So listen to what are you hearing when you're getting that resistance? What keeps coming up as the reason, or what's the justification there? So empathize. Okay. Then, is it a priority? Can you allow that? Do you want to allow it? Do you need to keep pushing? Okay, so you've got to assess those priorities. Then if it's a priority that you need to move through this resistance, then you use those persuasive abilities, right? We pull in allies. We use persuasive abilities. But what makes you persuasive is that ability to understand why you're getting that resistance. Is it budget? Is it timing? Is it a lack of understanding? Maybe you're getting resistance because the other person or the other team doesn't really understand why you're requesting this. They don't understand the complexity. Maybe they just need a little bit more understanding of it so that they see their role in the complexity of all this. So that's what a product manager internally often gets, that resistance as they're trying to, because these are departments, they all have their own priorities, and a lot of times they're in conflict. So the product manager is that one person that sort of looks across all of them. And, that's why it's so challenging, because the product manager sits externally. But that's also the beauty of that role. You don't have a favoritism of one of the or more of these departments, that you are that external person that spans that. So I hope that kind of helped.
Excellent. Well, I think so. We have another question as well. Sorry, it's a bit loud in here. If you were going to launch a brand new product to your customers, what would be your advice to approach this?
So launching a new product, so it would depend on what the portfolio look like. Is this a new product in an existing portfolio? Are we launching a new product line? So where does it sit internally? Okay. And then externally, I'd want to do the Porter's 5 forces for that new product. So do we have new suppliers for this new product? What's the competitive rivalry for the new product? Because it may be different than existing products that we have. Okay, so we may have a different set of competitors for this new product. So also looking at, do your pest analysis, also work with the internal department. So if what market research has been done, does it relate or can it relate to this new product? What was the product? Is this a new innovation? So that's going to need to be dealt with differently. A brand new innovation that doesn't have competitors versus where we are adding to the competitive space. We are adding a product to an existing competitive space. So that will be handled differently. For new products, new innovations, we want to look at that, Dr. Everett Rogers innovation curve. So that's important to look at the adoption rates as well. So that's just, that's an incredibly complex question, but that's just a bit of an overview. I hope that helped too.
No, I think that's great. It's probably a good place to start, and hopefully, if that didn't answer everyone's question, then they can get in touch with you and maybe or get in touch with us. It's up to you. If you want some more information, that's great. If you want to get onto a certified product manager program, we currently have one running in March in Manchester with Paula, I believe, and yes. So get in touch with us if you have any questions. And is there any more? I don't think there's any more in the feed in terms of questions, so we can probably close it off there. We've had some lovely comments that everyone can read there, and thank you so much for everyone who's joined us. Paula,
thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.